Welcome back to another tutorial. We are going to start talking about the circulatory system. Specifically, we'll really get in depth about the heart today. It's probably one of my favorite topics that we do all semester. I just find it fascinating, so I hope you enjoy this as well. We can't talk about the heart until we talk a little bit about blood vessels in general, so we'll backtrack just a little bit. The heart, the whole purpose of the heart is that it's a pump, and it powers the ability for the blood to move through our blood vessels. Now, there are different types of blood vessels. There are arteries. Arteries are, they're very elastic. Think about a tough rubber band. It's hard to stretch. So they create a lot of pressure. When blood is pushed into them, almost like a new balloon before you blow it up and you really have to stretch it out, they get stretched out. But when they recoil, they produce propulsion, produce more energy behind that blood flow to move. So arteries are going to be more elastic. This is helpful when you think about embalming and you're trying to identify, is this a vein? Is this an artery? Arteries will retain their shape, kind of look circular, and they'll feel thicker, like a rubber band underneath your fingers that's been folded up. Arteries start out large from the heart. You've got the big aorta, and it continues to bifurcate and change and move different directions, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually, as it's headed to the target organ, whatever needs blood flow, because blood contains oxygen in it. So say you're trying to go to your little finger. The arteries continue to split and split and split and get smaller and smaller. And then the last little bit before they get to the capillary bed of your finger to exchange oxygen, they become what we call arterioles, very, very tiny vessels. Those vessels become capillary beds, and capillary beds are a network of vessels that are only wide enough for one red blood cell to pass through at a time. This creates a lot of surface area for oxygen to be unloaded into the tissues and any waste or carbon dioxide to be taken out of the tissues and loaded back onto the red blood cell to start its journey back to the heart. Now, as we leave the capillary bed, we start with very, very small veins called venules. Those venules then become larger as they continue to grow together. So you had a lot of small ones spread out. They're all headed back to the heart, same direction, and they start to consolidate and eventually become one larger vessel as they return to the heart. Now veins, we said arteries are thicker and hold a muscular wall, and they feel more like a folded up rubber band underneath your fingers. Veins don't have to have a lot of pressure. They're just trying to return the blood back to the heart. So you may see valves in veins to keep blood flow from coming back because there is such low pressure. And veins are very thin underneath your fingers and they collapse. So when you're looking at these vessels, the one that's collapsed is a vein. We mentioned earlier, you can kind of think of the acronym NAVAL: nerve, artery, vein, and lymph. They all run together in the same area. When you find one, you often find the others. As we move forward, we just want to give you a quick hint into what makes up blood. This is just as straightforward as what I'm going to show you as far as organizing information. We've talked about this twice before. This is now the third time reiterating, if you will just take basic information, organize it, and color code it, it will help you so much more in retaining that information. Let's look at the makeup of blood. So if you look at blood, it really can be broken down into two different major components. One is plasma. The other, formed elements. And I even, for myself, put little parentheses above. Okay, so plasma is more of the liquid and formed elements are more of the solids, if that helps you remember some things better. Plasma makes up a little more than half, about 55% of the composition of blood. Formed elements about 45%, and that fluctuates a little bit depending on if you're dehydrated, male, female. There's a little fluctuation there. Plasma consists of water, serum, dissolved proteins. So what happens is you have this water and you dissolve these proteins in it and create this kind of serous solution. Dissolved proteins that you'll find in there are albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen. With the formed elements, these are these major structures that aren't dissolved, but they're whole in the blood. You'll find small particles such as erythrocytes. Now, If you remember your medical terminology, eryth means red, cyte means cell. But if you can't recall that off the top of your head, make it make sense. Remember, read for understanding. Organize your information. You want this to make sense to you. So I put underneath there RBC, red blood cell. I know an erythrocyte's a red blood cell, but if this term doesn't stick in my head, I'll know formed elements consist of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Then on the test, on the exam, if I see some of these larger words, I know how to break them down. Leuko means white, cyte means cell. So I know, oh yeah, that's right, white blood cells are part of our formed elements. This is as simple as it needs to be for you in understanding what is the composition of blood. More liquid than solid. You're going to find dissolved proteins in here. Over here, you're going to find red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, helping with clotting, fighting infection, delivering oxygen, taking off the carbon dioxide. That's how simple it should be. Some of you will be beating your head against the wall trying to memorize this. If you'll organize it and color code it, it'll be much faster for you. Try that for yourself. All right, on to my favorite part of this section, the heart. The heart is an amazing muscle. With the heart, it feels overwhelming and complex at first, but when you just break it down to its simple chambers, all it's doing is taking blood from one area to the next, oxygenating it, and then moving it on along into the body. I'm going to draw a few simple diagrams that might help you, and then we'll come back and look at some of the major structures of the heart as well. When we look at the heart isn't necessarily in this perfect heart-like shape, but it resembles it. You'll notice that the superior portion of the heart is actually wider, and so we call this the base of the heart. And we call this the apex of the heart because the apex is the point. So it kind of feels upside down to you. I'm going to erase the heart shape just for the sake of showing you the chambers of the heart. Now, if you think of the heart, think of it as a box with 4 separate sections in it. This side, remember, it's based off of anatomical position. This is the right side. So the top, most superior chamber is called the right atrium. So we have the right atrium. Below it, inferiorly, you will find the right ventricle. Now, the reason I did this in blue is because it is receiving blood from the body. So whether it's from your feet down here or from your head up here, blood flow returns to the right atrium, and it's deoxygenated blood. It's already been used, and it brings back waste like carbon dioxide that needs to be offloaded. So deoxygenated blood comes into the right atrium through the superior vena cava, major blood vessel, and the inferior vena cava. They come together, dump into the right atrium. There's one other blood vessel that you will find there, and it's hidden in the wall of the heart. The heart is a muscle. It requires oxygen. It uses up that oxygen, and then it has to get rid of its carbon dioxide as well. The leftover venous flow of the blood comes back around into the right atrium through the coronary sinus. So I'm just going to put a CS here. I don't want to get too jumbled. Coronary sinus here. So 3 major vessels come in: coronary sinus, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, all deoxygenated blood from the body. Okay? It dumps into the right atrium, and then the right atrium has these little flaps here, these little valves. And we find a valve here. This is called your tricuspid valve. One way to help you remember that is you often ride a tricycle before you can ride a bicycle, right? So the first valve we come to is the tricuspid valve. So I'm just going to write tri up there. When blood comes into the right atrium, it dumps into the right ventricle next. The right ventricle is going to pump blood out of the heart. He's not going next door yet. We're actually going to leave the heart. That's why I left a gap here. This right atrium and right ventricle receives blood flow from the body, and it's sending it to the lungs. In order for that right ventricle to contract and not send blood back up into the right atrium and get backflow, what happens, these valves shut closed. It's kind of like if you think of a parachute. And this is the parachute. It has little bitty strings that attach down and help hold it down in the muscle wall. So in wind, when the force inflates and fills that parachute, it gets really taut, right? That's what happens with these valves, is that when this right ventricle contracts, it hits that parachute and it can't go any further. Those valves close shut. And it means the blood can only exit one way. The blood goes from the right ventricle and it's going to the lungs. We find capillary beds at the organs that are our target, like we talked about the finger. We talked about arteries to arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins. Capillaries are where oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. It doesn't happen anywhere else along the way. You have to find a capillary bed. We find that at our target structures in our body, and then we find it again at the lungs. Because what's the purpose, the function of our lungs? To exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. As we make it to the lungs, we offload the deoxygenated blood, loaded with carbon dioxide, we give it to the lungs. Respiratory system, right? We've brought in oxygen, and now those red blood cells take on all of the oxygen, and what we now have is oxygenated blood that returns into the left atrium of the heart. So now we've returned to the heart. We've gone body, right side of the heart, lungs, left side of the heart. That left atrium also has a valve so that we don't have blood flow come back in. As we go left atrium into left ventricle, this is the thickest wall of the heart. It has to be the strongest muscle because it has to pump blood out of a very thick artery, your aorta. It has to generate a lot of force because blood goes from a high area of pressure to a low area of pressure. If we want it to move in one direction, highest pressure is going to be here as we push that blood out to the aorta. And then pressure will only decrease as it finally makes its way back to the right atrium. And that's where we really see the pressure being the lowest as we come back to the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, and it just barely dumps the blood back in. Let's go back and pick up a few structures through here. Right atrium to right ventricle, we said there was a valve called the tricuspid valve. It's going to mimic that same thing on the left side. Left atrium to left ventricle. In order to prevent backflow, we have what can be called the bicuspid valve or mitral valve. That's probably the most common term you will hear, the mitral valve. Now, there are two other places that we see valves. After you've pumped blood to the lungs, we're going through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. And in order to prevent backflow, we see a valve here between pulmonary artery and that right ventricle. We also see another valve here at the aorta because it's like a rubber band, and when that rubber band gets stretched and it recoils, we'll get some blood that wants to push back into the heart, and we don't want backflow into the heart. So we will see the valve close here, and that's called your aortic valve. There, we'll see a valve there as well. So let's go back through blood flow, and then we'll do these structures again. Blood comes from the body, used up of its oxygen, comes into the right atrium. Right atrium contracts gently, doesn't have to do much, it just kind of flows in to the right ventricle. Right ventricle contracts and is sending deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The tricuspid valve closes, pulmonary valve opens, we head to the lungs. Through the pulmonary artery, to arterioles, capillaries in the lungs, venules, veins, and we come back to the heart. Here's one tricky thing. This will trip you up if you're not careful. Arteries always take blood away from the heart. We tend to think arteries always have oxygenated blood, which is true most of the time, except for right here. We just said deoxygenated blood is leaving the right ventricle, and it's headed to the lungs via pulmonary artery. Arteries take blood away from the heart, but it's deoxygenated there. That is one change. And when the pulmonary vein, because veins bring blood back to the heart, it actually is oxygenated blood because it's coming back into the left side of the heart. We bring blood into the left side of the heart on the left atrium, dumps blood into the left ventricle, mitral valve closes, left ventricle contracts, pushes blood through the aortic valve and into the aorta. This is one of my favorite things because it's so complex yet so simple, and your heart does it on demand so many times a day, so many times a minute, so many times a day. It adjusts as needed. It's pretty amazing. Now, I have this heart model here. I just want to show you a few structures. So the heart, like we said, isn't a perfect heart shape that we typically think of. It has a narrow apex kind of towards the bottom inferiorly, and the base is larger at the top. Now the heart sits a little bit tilted to the left and a little bit rotated. So when you see the right side of the heart, this is the right atrium, right ventricle here. The right atrium, right ventricle, I'm going to open up the walls a little bit so that you can see. What you see are almost like those parachute strings. Those are called chordae tendineae. Those are like parachute cords that are attached to our valve. And then you have these papillary muscles. If you look at the wall of the heart, it almost looks like little mounds or mountains. Those are muscles that contract and hold those parachute strings, those chordae tendineae, hold them down so that the valve stays taut and cannot collapse and allow backflow to happen. As we look at the left side of the heart, the wall of the heart is much thicker because it has to push through this elastic and overcome the elastic force of the aorta. So on the front, coming from the right ventricle is blue, but this is the pulmonary artery because it's deoxygenated blood headed to the lungs. It divides, goes to the lungs, comes back, oxygenated blood through the pulmonary vein, left atrium, left ventricle, and then gets pumped through the aorta out to the rest of the body. These are basic structures of the heart. This is the way blood flow occurs. The best thing you can do is to just try and trace it through on your own. Start at the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and start tracing a red blood cell through the pathway of the heart, to the lungs, back to the heart. And then in our next time, we'll start talking about blood vessels. Do the same thing for blood vessels. Take that red blood cell, trace it all the way to that little finger and back. It's the best way to learn blood vessels and blood flow through the heart. Good luck studying.